Here, I think we're going to just get started. So, good afternoon to most of you, and a very warm welcome to the second event of Birdfoot's 10th season. What an exciting, incredible anniversary. Many of you know me already. I'm Jenna Sherry, Artistic Director of the festival. And today we are going to be exploring the topic of texture, and especially the exquisite textures of soft sounds in composer Katherine Balch's string quartet called Drip Music, with the Argus Quartet, who I will introduce in just a moment. First, I'd like to give another huge thank you to all of Birdfoot's sponsors, program advertisers, and in fact, all of you, many of you in the audience, who have made 10 years of Birdfoot Festival possible. I'd especially like to thank the Selly Foundation and the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival Foundation for their support. I'd also like to recognize the incredible work of the entire Birdfoot team, especially Birdfoot's board members, Birdfoot's executive director, Tracy Sherry, and Birdfoot's operation production manager, Gianna Sachere. If you're joining us from outside of New Orleans, an extra warm welcome. Well, not an extra, but an equally warm welcome. And we'd love to know where you're coming from, as I said before. And for those listening on YouTube, which is hopefully working now, a very warm welcome. And please put your questions in the chat. That goes for all of you here in the room as well. And we would be very grateful if you would consider, if you're listening on YouTube, if you would consider making a donation through Birdfoot's website as your ticket price, because all of this makes these events possible. As I mentioned before, you can find a link to the season program in the chat and on Birdfoot's website. And I also encourage you today to grab a piece of paper and a pencil if you'd like. Pencil or markers if you like, because today's theme lends itself particularly well to visual analogies, and you might enjoy doodling along with us. And now it is such a pleasure to introduce the members of the wonderful Argus Quartet. Clara, who many of you may recognize from Birdfoot festivals past with her Birdfoot t-shirt. Giancarlo in the blue shirt. Maren and Audrey, will each of you introduce yourselves? And for fun and so we can get to know you better, if you were not a musician, what would you be and why?
Hi everyone, I'm Clara. So nice to see you all and meet you all if I don't know you already. I am one of the violinists in the Argus Quartet, and we're super excited to be here today for Birdfoot Backstage, which is personally one of my favorite events that happens at Birdfoot festivals. So thank you all so much for joining. If I was not a violinist or a musician, I think probably I might be a chef because I love to eat.
Hi everyone, I'm Giancarlo Latta. I'm the other violinist in Argus Quartet, and like Clara said, we're super excited to be here. I personally have been hearing a lot about Birdfoot over the years from Clara, and it's exciting for the three of us who haven't been part of the festival before to get to, albeit virtually, join for this season. So thank you, Jenna, and thanks to everyone at Birdfoot Festival. If I was not a musician, I would be a writer because I really love reading and writing, and I really love language and words, and I would find that pretty interesting.
Hi everyone, I'm Maren. I'm the violist in the group, and you probably will hear my accent a bunch. I'm from Germany. I grew up there, so when things sound weird, it's probably me. And the more nervous I get, the weirder my accent gets. But I'm so excited to see you all and share the music with you all today. If I would not be a musician, I think I would be something like a physiotherapist or an osteopath. Because I'm like kind of more hands-on than Giancarlo, for example. I like to figure out how things work and how the body works and how things are connected. It's very fascinating.
Hi everyone, I'm Audrey and I'm the cellist of the quartet. And I think that if I were not a musician, I would probably be wanting to do something related to design, but specifically human-centered design. So I just like learning about other people and how they work and behave, and then doing something with that to create exciting experiences, kind of like how Birdfoot does this for all the musicians and the audience members out there. So I'm really excited to be here.
And I was told that I should also join this game. If I was not a musician, and I was really struggling to come up with what I should say, but I've just picked one for today of all the things I loved. If I was not a musician, I think I might be an architect, because I love the way that architects think about not only the outside shape of the space, but the inside dimensions and how that influences sort of how we behave and experience things. So I find that quite fascinating. So now, before we jump into the music, I wanted to leave you with to share something I've been thinking about since the last event. For those of you who are here at the last event, it was Birdfoot's first and online, and I wanted to share with all of you who are here today how strange it is to be doing this event online, and yet at the same time how delighted and grateful I am. And during the last event, I kept having this very strange feeling of somehow not being able to sort of feel the warmth and the energy coming back from all of you audience members that I'm so used to. And in thinking about it the last few days, I decided that I'm going to sort of psychologically pretend I can and just, go for it as we would. So I just wanted to sort of be honest and share with you how strange it is doing this kind of an event online. And yet how excited I am to see all of you who are here with us. So I also wanted to share a few thoughts on today's texture, on today's, not texture, today's topic. The word texture evokes something so tactile, the feel of velvet or sandpaper or the pattern of a brick wall, for example. If you run your fingers over the pattern of your clothes or the table or chair you're sitting at or anything near you, the feel of each surface will communicate something to you. Perhaps sort of solidity, a cool solidity, or luxury if you've got some sort of a nice material, or maybe crumbs. And in the way that our fingertips gather information, sounds also have textures that our ears perceive that add a sort of an extra dimension to the way we experience and feel music and what it communicates to us. So as we go, as I mentioned before, I encourage you to have a pencil and paper with you and experiment, if you want, with sort of translating what you hear and these sounds you hear and the ideas we're talking about into something more seeable and tactile. And now, to launch this exploration of texture and beautiful sounds and music, the Argus Quartet has proposed an experiment. So Giancarlo, over to you, take it away.
Thanks. All right, so before we get started here, can we all just close our eyes for a moment, take a deep breath, and just take a minute to listen to the sounds around you. What do you hear? Maybe the heater or the refrigerator, maybe the computer vent. I'm hearing, actually appropriately for today, the sound of raindrops on the top of my air conditioner right outside the window here. So just take note and think about, do you like these sounds? Are they interesting to you? What do they make you feel? So let's just listen for about 10 seconds. So let's open our eyes and feel free to drop in the chat what you heard or noticed, or any unique sounds that you might have found around you.
We'd love to encourage all of you, if you want, to use the chat to either ask questions or contribute to the conversation, jump in as we go today. We'll sort of save the formal Q&A for last, but please chime in. So I'm reading sounds of the fridge humming, police sirens, the rain from John Carlo's computer fan, footsteps upstairs, wind, a ceiling fan, all of these sort of soft sounds that tell you something about your environment. Wonderful. So it's interesting to become aware of these. Many of you may know of John Cage's famous 4 minutes and 33 seconds piece, which is supposedly silence, but in fact just gets everyone to sort of tune into these little sounds around them. And so now going on, and with this in your mind, perhaps we wanted to share, I'll hand it to Maren to introduce the next part.
Exactly. We actually went specifically around in our houses and looked for sounds that we thought were interesting, delicate, but just like something you hear frequently, maybe, but really shining the spotlight on them for a second. I think, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was just gonna say maybe let's go in score order, and then Jenna goes last. How about
Okay, so Clara,
Sure.
your
So
sound
this is
first.
my sound.
It's a wonderful tinkly quality of the ice. Giancarlo?
Here's mine.
Sort of similar to Clara's, but with a very different, a much more explosive start. Maren, what did you bring?
something different?
Oh, if I was a cat, I would really like that.
Exactly. I stole it from the cat in the house.
What do you have, Audrey? Wonderful. And I brought something that has a different texture, the lid of this little pot. You get a little bit of the resonance inside and a nice sort of a nice texture, but still with some pitch in it. So I'm really curious. After listening to these small sounds, some of them a little weird, like the cat toy, what does this have to do with the piece of music we're listening to today?
Well, good question, Jenna. Actually, the piece that we're going to share with you today is all about these types of tiny, beautiful sounds. And these are sounds that we actually can make on our instruments. And they transition over time and evolve into something quite different. So actually, maybe we can start with a little excerpt from the beginning. The piece is called Drip Music, and it's by our friend Katherine Balch. Here's a little bit of the beginning for you to hear. Did you all hear those dripping sounds?
It's just beautiful. I feel the texture is so delicate. I feel I sort of have to lean in to catch everything. But it's also really fascinating to see the score, because whether or not you can read the music, there's something in the visual representation that really captures what I was hearing, these little sort of drips, as you said.
Yeah, exactly. Something that we love about drip music is that it contains so many of these fascinating little textures. And in fact, the textures and the sounds change and develop from these tiny droplets that you just heard into something very different by the end of the piece. At the risk of giving away the end, we want to play you a tiny bit of the ending so you can hear just how different it is.
Wow, that's such different music. There's sort of waves of sound surging and crashing in this intensity that is completely different from the beginning. I'm really curious to hear how the music is going to develop over about 10 minutes, right? From these small textures into this. But I'll slow down. Let's go back to the beginning. Could you show me how you made those dripping sounds at the beginning? I didn't quite catch that.
Yes, I'm really glad you asked because Catherine, the composer, had such an incredible idea for how to make these sounds on our instruments. So what we're doing here is we're actually using metal sewing thimbles, just like this. So we put them on our fingers and tap along the strings with them. It sounds something like this. Does it sound perhaps a little like water droplets? I was thinking about it earlier. To me, it sounds a little bit like the beginning of a rainstorm when you're in the car hearing the droplets on the tin roof of the car. So this beautiful sound can be used in many different ways, and as if this wasn't already amazing enough, Catherine actually takes things a couple of steps further with it. So first of all, the sound changes depending on where along the strings we tap, so we can manipulate it to sound higher or lower in pitch. It's a very, very delicate and subtle sound. And finally, we have one more beautiful sound, which Catherine calls the swish, where we slide the thimble over the string like this. So I love how detailed and unique these sounds and gestures are, especially when the tapping and swishing sounds appear simultaneously. So at this point, you're probably starting to get a good sense of why this piece is called drip music. But now that we've explored it on our instruments, let's see if we can find something similar to the tapping and the swishing in our everyday environments. So I think Audrey is cooking something up for us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to my kitchen. So what I'm going to actually do for you today is create a little improvisation with my kitchen sink right here. I have some pots and a little metal bowl down there. Let's see if you can see that. And I also have a thimble on my finger, which I will use to also create some swishing sounds by tapping it on the top of the faucet. So here goes.
Brava.
Bravo! We should give Audrey a hand. We also should point out it's actually not that easy to make all these like drip sounds exactly the way they're supposed to drip. So Audrey, you're really good at faucet. I tried it out myself. You should all try it at home. It's really fun.
You will never wash dishes in the same way again after today.
I promise. I'm actually going to introduce the next sound that's gonna come. So we heard the dripping sounds of with the thimbles, and then there's another kind of drip that joins, sort of like a bigger drop amongst all these tiny driplets. And I found a sound at home too that is sort of similar, but kind of has the, well, it doesn't come out the way it should. It does.
The lovely bass rubber band.
Or the more higher rubber band. So what I'm going for here, I don't know if it comes through. Sometimes it doesn't as well.
It sounds great. And what's the parallel in the piece?
The parallel in the piece here is that we're starting to find these big drops. That's why I used the bass rubber band first, because we want the bigger drops in the tiny drops. But you can probably guess we're going to start pizzing. We're going to use pizzicato on our instrument. And first, they're just one pizzicato here and there, but very high. And you hear when they're so high up here, the tension of the string is really, really strong. So when I pizz, I actually feel the really hard texture of the string, the metal texture. And it also comes out as a pretty sharp and spiky texture in the sound. But then over time, and this is where the pizzicati actually take over the thimble sounds, we have these sharp pizzicato repeat, and then they form a line. And this one is then rather smooth in comparison. And then later on, these repeated pizzicati also start to bend a little bit in pitch, so even smoother.
That's such a visual. I mean, I can sort of picture a curved line in the way that all these little dots are now starting to outline some kind of a form. It's beautiful.
And this might be a moment where you also might want to try that a little bit on your paper, if you like. So the single dots are very different to when you actually line up the dots in a line. And even visually, the visual texture also changes. I find that very fascinating.
So after the thimbles tapping and after we start plucking our instruments, there's another dripping sound that emerges out of the texture. And that's when we start tapping with not the normal part of the bow that we use, which is the hair, but the solid part, which is made of wood. And it sounds similar in some ways, but also has a different, very special color and timbre. And it sounds like this. So sometimes we have just a couple sort of pointillistic ones that Maren was sort of alluding to. And we can also let the bows gently bounce on the string to get a several, kind of to make a line. And we can, similar to the thimbles tapping on the string, they can go down or up.
I'm fascinated to hear that each of these things that you've talked about so far are actually little points or dots of sound. And yet each one has its own sort of timbre. Perhaps this is a word we could add to the discussion of texture. Timbre is a word that's used a lot in music to sort of mean the quality of the music. We could almost say the texture or the sort of resonance of the music.
Yeah, actually the timbre, color of the timbre is a really beautiful exploration. And so I went kind of looking around my home to see what I had that was made of wood or different sort of hard type of similar material. And I found a pencil and I wanted to see what kind of sound it would make. And it's very similar, but the color of it is a little bit different. I would love for you to hear that. So here are some single dots. and some ricochets, letting it bounce.
It's lovely, but it's interesting how much the sort of soft wood of the pencil is a lot less beautiful and resonant than that wonderful hardwood of the bow. It shows you what a special wood our bows are made of.
So now that we've heard a few of the textures that Katherine uses in drip music, and we've also found some sort of everyday instruments around our homes that create similarly delicate and evocative sounds, I think we should put these together in a little improvisation, perhaps, into a little piece. So I think it's really cool how Katherine was inspired to find these tiny dripping sounds with thimbles, and in turn, she inspired us to find our own tiny sounds. So let's put them all together to create a larger, denser texture. First, the thimble taps with the dripping faucet, Audrey's virtuoso kitchen performance, then the plucked rubber band, and finally the tapping and bouncing of the pencil on the violin strings.
And if I understand this, you're sort of simulating with these sort of home noises the trajectory of the piece that we're going to hear after. Is that true?
Yes, you'll sort of
Amazing.
hear how things develop in the same way that they might develop later.
Let's hear it.
in Katherine's piece.
Wow. Virtuosos. While this music is while these sounds are so fresh in our ears, can we now listen again to the beginning of drip music? It's beautiful. I'm listening to these sounds in a completely different way. And the question that really comes to mind for me is, when do these sort of little noises actually become music? Where is that line? I mean, for all of your virtuoso rubber band plucking and faucet dripping, would we call that music? But clearly in this piece, it becomes that. And I wonder if it has to do with this repetition or if there's a sort of intentionality. Perhaps that's something we can come. Clara, do you have any thoughts?
That's a really great question, Jenna. And when we play pieces by Haydn or Mozart, I would love to ask them things about their pieces. But when we today are able to play pieces by living composers, it's awesome to be able to text them or call them or to ask. And today we're especially lucky because we have the composer here with us. Katie, would you like to say hi and introduce yourself? And maybe you can pick up on the question that I avoided.
Hi, it looks like I can't start my video.
Oh, let me help. Can you now?
Oh, yes.
Great.
Hi. 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 You guys, it's really touching to hear you talk about my music with such care. And that's not something a living composer gets to witness very much. So it's really nice.
Well, Katie, it's such a pleasure to have you here, and thank you from joining us from Rome. How exciting. I wanted to ask you to reflect on this question of when sound becomes music, and to ask you also about, I know you have an interest as a composer in these sort of very delicate sounds. I'll call them sounds now instead of music. And I wonder if you can tell us what sparked your interest in these delicate noises, and was there a particular moment when this started?
Um, well, I think like, I'm a pretty small person, so I was always really interested in small things. But when I was a graduate student, when I was doing my master's, I took this intro to botany class and started working in the botanical gardens of the school I was at. And actually, it was where I met the Argus Quartet at Yale. And I got really into plant acoustics and the study of the different sorts of very, very low decibel, quiet sounds that plants make.
Really?
Yeah.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So like, for example, when water is being taken up from the roots of the plants and traveling up the roots to the leaves, it travels through this system called xylem. And xylem are these like straws, and you can amplify those and hear the sort of the plants sucking up water. But in addition to them taking up water like a straw, like you would imagine, they also are all the time dealing with things called embolisms, like these air bubbles that get caught in their straw-like systems, and the plants are always having to divert around these air bubbles and open up like new paths for water to travel. So it's sort of like a movable straw highway. And when that happens, it creates this popping sound, this very delicate popping sound. And that's when there's like an air bubble that gets sort of sealed off and water is diverted. And
Wow.
it's like really beautiful. I can share a recording if you guys have like a website or something. I can.
We would love that. Maybe we can collect that after with you and share it with everyone who's here today. That's really fascinating. And I wanted to also ask you, I understand that you've brought with you a sort of interesting sound to share with us.
Yeah. So one of the things I've been working on in Rome is an installation of automated wind chimes that I've made out of aluminum cans. And so this is what one of them looks like. And they're just like cut up pieces of these are like LaCroix cans because my husband is like addicted to seltzer water. And they get activated by little DC motors that sort of plug into this little thing. I just 3D printed at the top here, and they kind of sound like this.
Wow, gorgeous. I can imagine a flock of those would almost start to sound like a sort of a silvery forest.
Yeah. So the installation is called Aluminum Forest, and it'll be hung outside in one of the gardens here in Rome.
Wonderful. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is going back to this idea at the beginning and what Giancarlo said about the way that small sounds inspired a lot of your compositions. And we in turn have sort of reversed that process today by sort of finding and trying to make musical our own household sounds. I wanted to ask you about sort of musical fingerprints of places. So for example, at the beginning when people were talking about the fridge humming or the neighbor's door slamming or a car on the street, these sort of sounds that are particular to a certain place in a way tell us where you are. And I wonder, what are those sounds like where you are in Rome, and were they noticeably different when you arrived there to where you lived before?
Where I was before Rome was in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. So it was a very different soundscape. And before that, I was in New York City in the height of the pandemic. And yeah, these sort of sonic identities of places are something I know I've been noticing a lot during this sort of time. And I've written some pieces that are really just about taking field recordings, making recordings of the sound around me. And actually, I think Giancarlo has played one of them, the one I made about my little sonic fingerprint of New York. But yeah, the sounds in Rome, I think, are a lot like the sounds in New York City, but Italian.
How can you tell they're Italian?
Well, I mean, like, people speak Italian. And the sirens in Europe are really different than the sirens in New York. The sirens are actually like really melodious here, and different companies have different intervals. So like dee 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 dee, like some companies have like dee da dee da dee da dee da, and so yeah, so there's like a much more melodious siren soundscape, which is kind of depressing, but
Fascinating.
and the birds here are amazing. There are parakeets everywhere in Rome. And they make a very high chirping sound.
Interesting. And then just briefly, can you tell us what inspired this piece in particular, this idea of drip music, before we go on and sort of hear how it accumulates?
I honestly, I don't really remember. But I remember really loving the thimble sound and spending a lot of time experimenting and improvising with that sound and the different ways I could find gesture and phrase from that sort of sonic object, kind of like what you were talking about with the dots. And what happens if you just put a dot on a page versus if you put a dot in a line versus like, yeah, this sort of, how can you make this like very, very tiny isolated sonic object into something that has like a shape and a phrase and a momentum.
Wow, well, I think this brings us, thank you so much, Katherine. I think this brings us to the next important section of the piece. Audrey, would you like to introduce it?
Yeah, so this next section you'll hear starts to get a lot more, it's definitely a lot more different than what you've just heard. And as a kind of visual image that I want to give you all, whenever I play this next section of the piece, I'm reminded of raindrops on the window, as you can see is my virtual background. But specifically when the raindrops start accumulating and just flowing down and they leave that tail of water behind. So actually, Clara, would you like to demonstrate some of the pizzicato that actually creates this effect?
So yeah, so you can hear this kind of being passed around the group.
that similar to Marin's rubber band inspired sound?
Yeah, I'm imagining these water droplets turning into tails, and then you get the little tiny beads left behind in its wake. And it gradually, it also seems like these water droplets start taking a life of their own, and they actually just kind of fly off the window and begin dancing. So, Claire, would you like to play what I imagine is that sound?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we listen? Can we listen to how this section comes together?
Yes.
And after that, I find that we come to a section that to me sounds very much like a little river or a rivulet. And if you listen to this next section, maybe if you like drawing, I'd be interested what your motion is like when you draw according to what you hear. If your motion on the paper would be smooth or more jagged, or how that translates in what you do.
So you hear in that excerpt actually that we still have the two oscillating notes in each of our lines. And it's like we're adding to a conversation, voices one by one. So I start like this. And then Giancarlo joins. And Marin says.
To my ears, there's something about these gestures you're playing that have a sort of a splashing feel, a little bit like what Audrey said about the drops splashing out, but it feels to me like air and water are now mixing, and I notice you have nice watery backgrounds now.
Yes, and I also feel like over time, these splashes, they start to accumulate like more and more water. They get bigger and bigger. And then towards the end of the piece, it, to me, honestly, feels like that this gains more and more strength. And then we finally enter the sea. And then we have not only just water moving, but big waves crashing over each other.
Oh,
I think
So in the end, the texture of the music has totally transformed, as you can see. We had the droplets in the beginning, with the thimbles, the plucking, and the tapping of the bow, followed by the smaller trickles and rivulets with more melodic and rhythmic material and further use of the bow. And now I'll leave you to find out how this journey ends, and we'll have a chance in just a moment to hear the entire piece.
wonderful. So now we've sort of zoomed past, after dwelling a lot on the inspiration of these sounds, we've sort of zoomed through how they start to develop. And so we're going to sort of now move to the performance part of this piece. And we'd like to invite all of you, as soon as we're done, to ask any questions or reflections you might have for the Argus Quartet or for Katie. And I want to say, Katie, thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor to have the composer with us tonight. and to be able to ask them questions, as Clara, as you said, and to thank all of you who have joined us so much for being here. I also want to give a plug to a very exciting performance the Argus Quartet has coming up. They're going to be filming a performance in the Noguchi Museum in New York, and I've heard just enough of this about this performance that I really can't wait to hear it. There's some incredible pieces, including a string quartet by John Cage on this program, and right now the premiere has not quite been announced, but it's being put on by the Five Boroughs Music Festival in New York. And if you go to their website or the Argus website, you can stay up to date on where that is, or follow the Argus Quartet on various social media channels. Just because if you enjoyed this tonight, you will love this performance coming up. Noguchi, for those of you who don't know, it was a sculptor. So this exploration of texture is right in line with their next concert. So now we're going to listen to the entire of Drip Music, which is about 10 minutes long. I encourage you to get out your papers. I'm going to doodle along for sure. And I wanted to encourage you to listen how the various textures, not only how the different textures have a different sort of feeling or emotional situational content, but also how they transform from one to the other, like weather or like a mood or perhaps something else. And I'm very curious whether in these transformations you hear narrative or you hear changing scenery or something else completely. I leave it to you to listen. And now, Drip Music by Katherine Balch. Wow, beautiful. If you all want to mute, we can give them a quick awkward round of applause. Shall we? Only awkward because of Zoom. Thank you. Thank you all so much. I'd like to open up the floor. You can all put your videos back on if you'd like. We'd love to see your smiling faces. And we'd love to hear your questions. Bravo, Argus Quartet. Thank you for your beautiful music, Katherine. Questions, if you want to raise your hand, I'll call on you. Oh, some people say they can't start the video. I think somehow we have to now do this manually. Sorry about that. Questions for the Argus Quartet or Katherine? Michael Ball.
Hey, everybody. And hello, Clara. It's nice to see you again. It's certainly been a while, and I'm so glad that all of y'all are here today. Oh man. So I just like to know, since we have a living composer with us today, was there any conversation or interaction between the quartet and the composer while the piece was being conceived? And like, what was that like? Like the conversation.
Clara, do you want to say something?
Over to you, Katie.
So it was a lot of back and forth about the thimble sound world at the beginning and what notation was most idiosyncratic, like what notation felt intuitive and not overly fussy, how sparse or dense the texture of the thimbles should be in the beginning. And so there were a few times I think we met where I brought you guys some sketches at Juilliard, and we just rehearsed and workshopped some things, and I made a bunch of recordings. And yeah, there was definitely a lot of back and forth in the beginning, getting that opening sound world right.
I think that's one of the super fun and interesting things about being able to commission a composer like Katie, who's just so innovative and so creative, and has, I think, such a beautiful way of like creating this whole world in a piece. And it's so cool to be able to sort of work with her to be able to bring it to life, essentially. It's like sort of exists in her brain, and she's experimented a lot with it, but to actually have it come out in the quartet, we did rework a number of details in the work, and she was asking us questions like, how is this, or is this possible? Or we would play something for her and be like, Katie, can you rewrite this one part, because we can't, technically do it in the way that sort of could be imagined. So we sort of swapped some parts sometimes, some notes sometimes, and just did a lot of detail work. But I think that process is just, I'm trying to think of a way to put it. It's just so amazing to be a part of, to be able to see the work kind of develop over time from sketches and ideas into something more concrete, and then sort of pinning it down to in sort of a completion, getting towards a performance, and thinking about what sort of in turn that transition from what does a composer want to like what do we as artists, as a quartet, what do we want to bring to the stage, how can we translate that intention and take ownership of it when we bring it to an audience. So I think that process is one of my favorite parts about working with amazing composers like Katie.
I think it's easy to imagine that like the people like Beethoven and Brahms were writing their scores all alone in their rooms and then handing them off to players. But those processes were also very collaborative, and the sort of myth of the composer as like one distinct entity and the performer as another is like a funny 19th century thing that's isn't really how music is made pretty much most of the time.
I find it fascinating how hearing this conversation, how it sort of reflects on even how we think about, as you were saying, music by Beethoven or Brahms, in the way that we asked you, Katie, well, where did the idea for this piece head? And you said, well, actually, I can't remember. It sort of shows that perhaps there's some details that we might, now I wonder what details are there about this music where we can't call up the composer that maybe weren't so important to them. And that's sort of also an interesting question to throw in the mix. There's a question in the chat about the role of vibrato in the texture of sound, which is a great one because this is one of these textural elements that we string players use all the time. And I wonder, and so the question is, how did you think about that in this piece? Was it that part of the conversation? Was it a given? Who wants to answer that?
I think I can start with it because this vibrato is a question that we talk a lot about, of course, and then there's in rehearsals in any given piece. And here I think we talked a little less about it just because we have so much to talk about with all the other sounds, but it also happens just by listening to each other a lot that there are certain times where we just really enjoyed this plain sound of the straight tone of what's been written on the page, and then sometimes, especially later on over the piece, I remember that we had a talk that generally vibrato, once we start bowing and having more of the finger bowed sounds, that over time we add more and more vibrato, just like more and more of the density of the texture comes, so that later on when it's just a whirlwind of sounds, the vibrato helps adding with the whirlwind. We had that discussion definitely. I think Katie hasn't put in a lot about vibrato, but here and there maybe like a note, but it's sort of also just the language of the piece is very clear, so it gives us something to just enhance with that. I don't know if anybody has something to add.
There's another question in the chat for Katherine about the sort of all of the non-musical influences in this piece and in some of your other works too. And given that, the question is, how do you balance this with the questioner says the need to maintain musicality? So I assume that's maybe perhaps a sort of melodic feeling. I guess my question would be, what is musicality? It goes back to this question we were asking earlier. We've kind of danced around, and maybe now we should go for it, of what's the difference between, and we can sort of go out on a limb here, what's the difference between sound and music? When does sound become music? And how do you balance that?
Yeah, I was thinking this question reminded me of the conversation that started to bubble up earlier. And it's something I think about a lot. And I think for me, sound becomes music through the intentionality of the listener. So if you have the intention of experiencing something as music, then it's music. And for me, in my intentionality as a listener in the world, I feel like I hear all these sounds as music and inherently rich with musicality. And what I feel like my job is as a composer is to share the listening experience of my intentionality with performers and with audiences. So maybe that's why my music often tends to like have these transformations to more sort of easily identifiable musical elements like harmony and melody, is because it's my way of sort of hopefully like maybe creating some sort of bridge between the intentionality of my listening and the listening intentionality of the audience.
That's really lovely, and it goes back to also what we touched on earlier. I can't remember which one of the quartet members it was who said in our rehearsal the other day about this, it almost feeling like we were doing a sort of double Google Translate process here of the idea of drips inspiring this music, and now we were translating them back into these sort of found sounds. And it seems to me like what you're doing, Katherine, in a way, is you're sort of translating the way you experience the world into something more concrete that we can sit and sort of get in your ears, as it were. There's another question in the chat, which is a question. This is a great question. A question about how all of the delicate sounds and interesting harmonics came across so clearly in the recording, and how do they come across, or how might they be different, and how might you perform them differently in a concert venue? How would the space influence how you would play them? Have you played this in a live hall? That seems like such a distant experience right now.
It seems very, very far away for sure. But actually, this was something that Katie worked very, very much with us on in leading up to the premiere, which was in Alice Tully, which is a very big hall. And that was one of our concerns, like, would they be able to hear anything for the first like minute or two of the piece, if they're sitting far back in the audience. And what we found with this piece, and I think with a lot of different pieces, and this kind of reminds me, Katie, of what you were talking about, the intentionality of the listener. What we found is, there are different types of listening as well. One where kind of like the sounds come to you and kind of wash over you. That might be sort of something I might experience like at the end of the piece. But at the beginning of the piece, I find that a lot of people really kind of lean forward and lean in and listen in a very different way. And I think that's a wonderful aspect of this piece, kind of playing upon that interaction with how we experience the music. And actually the sounds are very, very clear. I think, when people use the expression, you could hear a pin drop. If you kind of create this atmosphere where everybody's listening so intently, it's a wonderful experience actually to have all together.
There also is an acoustic explanation for why those sounds cut through they're very high frequency. And so when you think about what that vibration looks like, that's a vibration that doesn't travel very far, but it's a very clear, like it's like a laser beam of sound. So actually, like acoustically, if those sounds were happening but in a very low register, they wouldn't be as audible. But because they're happening very high, they actually tend to be pretty clear. At least that's the way our ears are able to perceive sound.
And it's interesting what you just said there, Clara, about creating an atmosphere in which you can hear a pin drop. This reminds me of something that you and I discussed briefly towards the beginning of the generation of this project, which was the idea of silence. And it occurs to me that this piece is such a beautiful example of how we often think of silence as nothing. But in fact, perhaps we should think of silence as more of a sort of a beautiful canvas on which, we're putting sound. So not something empty, but actually something with its own quality. And that quality is something that can perhaps be created in a concert hall. What a beautiful angle to it.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Jenna.
Well, it came from what you said. Are there some more questions? Another question in the chat. Oh, and Noel, do you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, so I found it very agreeable, and for me, it imitated nature from a very quiet waterfall to the ocean waves, and then in the depths of the ocean, I even thought I heard a whale or two in the sounds. But so I play the trumpet, and I can read music with regular notes. But my question for the ensemble would be this: that were you reading? I assume you're reading off of a score, and what kind of a score would that be that would show all of those notes in a distinct way? Is this a new genre of music that would have a completely non-traditional score?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I was fascinated.
We
And
shared a bit of that at the very beginning, but maybe Giancarlo, could you share? Does one of you have the score handy? Could we just share it again?
and
Because I think a few people
were they
came in
doing
after.
improv or were they following the score exactly?
I'll let one of you answer that.
So maybe I can share the score, and if somebody wants to just comment on it or observe anything from it while I have it up, feel free.
So maybe, Katie, do you want to talk a little bit about the sort of notational aspect, particularly at the beginning?
Yeah. So regarding the question of improvisation, the piece is through notated, which means that everything is written down in the score. So it essentially will sound, not as similar from performance to performance as a Beethoven string quartet would. And this is the first page of the score, and this is the thimble stuff. So you can see the way I notated it is I actually made my own clefs. So instead of like a treble or bass clef like you normally see, there
Yes.
is a clef that shows the part of the instrument that's the top of the fingerboard to the bridge.
Okay.
And that shows a sort of high, medium, and low position of where they should be playing the thimble. And then all the rhythms are just standard, rhythms. That when the like beam kind of separates into two sometimes in some of the gestures, those are called feather beams. Those are pretty standard contemporary notations. They're basically ways of saying a cello rondo, like speed up a little bit, but without being like overly fussy with tuplet notation.
What I like looking at it is how you've also played with the spacing between your notes, which are like our dots here,
Right.
in a way that's very intuitive. So as you show that you want the notes getting faster, you put them closer together, and that sort of intuitively comes across. It's beautiful.
I also
Yes.
write a lot of adjectives. Like I find that that's really helpful, like dolce, breathy, barely audible, dolcissimo. Like I use like a lot of just words to talk about the sound world I'm looking for. Because you're right that like notation sometimes can feel limiting. But we have all these other tools at our disposal to communicate sound, language, all these things. So.
And that's also a fascinating question. Maybe someone in the quartet wants to chime in this, but there's always this question about, it's the sort of the limits of notation. I mean, as there's Katie's put a lot on the score, and a lot of it's very intuitive, but then there's the sort of the role of the composer to try and understand, well, why did she put it like this? And it's not possible to sort of notate everything. So then you sort of have to get inside the sound world and make it your own. Does one of you in the quartet want to talk about that process of sort of inhabiting and this kind of music?
Yeah, I can speak a little to that. So, something that we did a lot of actually when we were rehearsing this piece was, as you get like later on the piece and as Giancarlo is scrolling, you'll see that as we spoke about throughout the beginning, this transition from the thimble to the plucking to the ricochet, and really kind of just isolating those moments so we hear the sound world that we're in and living in that, so that even if we are just playing everything that's on the score, you still have to know the context that you come from. So sometimes we would play one person at a time, would just do their little bit, and we'd kind of all sit back and listen, and then the next person would do it, and then the next, and then the next, and then once we put it all together, we're all immersed in that sound world and then can fully appreciate it. Otherwise, when we're playing, a lot of the times we're so focused on our own parts, we don't get to like really just sit and listen to the sound. And one other thing kind of that I really like, Katie, when we had asked you a lot of questions, and we were getting really specific and down to like this, what is the pitch of this one thimble note, which obviously you didn't notate, but you gave us like the visual kind of representation. And Katie said something along the lines of, it's beautiful how you guys are focusing on all these, as I would say, like the trees in a forest, but sometimes you have to also zoom out and just see that it is a giant forest. And we were all the way down to like the single pine needle or like a little like acorn or something. So you have to be able to zoom in and then out. And it's a really fun process overall to do that. So
Wonderful. I'm going to jump in here for a moment because I realize we've gone a bit over, and just thank all of you so much for joining us. If anyone needs to go, feel free. If there's any final questions, I think we're happy to stay and take those. And before you go, I just wanted to remind to thank the Argus Quartet, to thank Katie for being here, and remind all of you that there's another Birdfoot event in number 3 in 3 weeks, and the reservations have opened today on the Birdfoot website. So if you want to go and reserve your spot already, you can do that. And we will be exploring the concept of voices, which I think comes really nicely out of some of the ideas that came out of today, with some fugues by Mozart and Haydn, and the sort of looking at some similar fugues by Bach. And the idea is to look at how these voices interact and the sort of joyful explosions when they come together. Because I don't know about you, but I think I'm needing a bit of that in my life. And that will be a string quartet. I will also be playing in that. And it will be another textural exploration because it will be played on gut string. So I hope you can join us for that. And if there's any other questions, we can take a few more. If not, I'm sorry. Someone said the Voices event is in 2 weeks. Perhaps I didn't say that correctly. 2 weeks, which is April 11th, another Sunday, same time, same place. Any final questions? Then we will say good night. Thank you all so much. This is such a treat. And if you have questions that occur to you while you're washing dishes or doing something else today, feel free to message us. Hope to see you soon. Thanks. Bye.